thank you all so much for being here. And Leah, I'm so grateful for your nice invitation and your kind introduction. Speaking with ISPS is particularly meaningful to me because I study paradigm change and I promote paradigm change. And it seems to me that when it comes to paradigm change, there's little that's more important than changing our beliefs, our attitudes, and our approaches to those states that we call psychosis, from hearing voices to having unusual beliefs or to feeling detached from reality. Because in talking with some psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, I've often had the following experience where you say, we really need paradigm change in the way that we think about depression or in the way that we think about anxiety. We really need to develop and promote non-medicalizing frameworks and interventions. People say, that is great. I am so on board with non-medicalizing approaches and interventions to depression, anxiety. But if you say also, when it comes to those experiences that we often describe as psychosis, we really need alternative non-medicalizing frameworks and approaches, people suddenly go, whoa, you're taking things a little bit too far. We are talking about a serious medical condition. We are talking about people that may need to be hospitalized or medicated or subject to ongoing monitoring. So I think that developing and implementing these alternative frameworks and approaches is just an incredibly momentous but an incredibly valuable task. So here's what I want to do today. I'll first talk about my own history with psychiatry. Oops, here we go. And then I'll talk about the need for a paradigm change and some of the obstacles to paradigm change. In particular, I think it's vitally important to clarify exactly who or what our opponent is or what kind of ideas we're opposed to, because I think without that, we can be really hindered in this task. Then I'll talk about a particular conceptual framework that's emerged from my own historical work on psychiatry, and that's the distinction between what I call madness as dysfunction and madness as strategy. Or if you don't like the term madness, you could just talk about dysfunction and function perspectives. And then I'll talk about some of the benefits that I think we can get from using this particular conceptual framework, among others. And in addition to these slides, I do have a handout. Some of you have gotten it. Hopefully everybody has. I think it should be easy enough to follow along without the handout, but if you would like to have that for later reference, it's there. And in the handout, I have some, at the very end, I list an academic article that I recently wrote. It's available on my website. You can download it, and it has a lot of this, some of this information and ideas. So you can always go to that if you want more detail about some of the things that I'm saying. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about my own history and my family's history with psychiatry. So in the 1970s, actually a couple months after I was born, my dad was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And he was actually working under the American president, Richard Nixon, at the time, which I think probably explains an awful lot. And he formed the belief that he was being spied upon and surveilled. And of course, as some of you know, Nixon was quite famous for spying on and surveilling his staff. But then those beliefs began spiraling into something much more kind of extreme, that my mom was a spy, that the Washington Post was writing stories, articles about him under a fake name, that he had a tracking device inserted under his skin. But he had also read people like R.D. Laing and Rollo May, and he had this idea that sometimes the experiences that we call schizophrenia could really herald a kind of psychological or even a spiritual breakthrough. So he agreed to see a psychiatrist, but on the condition that he wouldn't be given drugs. He saw the psychiatrist, he wasn't given drugs, and he was able to continue working for about another 10 years. Well, then in the mid 1980s, so around 1986, he started having similar episodes. He started hearing voices. He heard God was talking to him. The French actress Catherine Deneuve was talking to him. But by that point, psychiatry had changed pretty radically. He would be hospitalized for long periods of time. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And he was given a combination of drugs that we now know to be neurotoxic. There was a drug called Mellaril, which was an antipsychotic, and then the lithium. And the drugs ultimately robbed him of his vitality. Eventually, he started having pretty severe motor problems, and those contributed to his death in 2005. And so I've long thought, well, what might have happened if my dad had access to alternative meaning-making frameworks for understanding his experiences? How might things have changed if he knew about organizations like Hearing Voices Network or ISPS, or just had the chance to connect with a therapist or a support group who that held non-medicalizing approaches to mental health crises. So then when I was 16, I was hospitalized for depression for about 6 weeks. And this was right at the height of the Prozac revolution. So this was in 1989. I was put on Prozac. And the overall message that I got was that there was something fundamentally wrong with the way that my brain was working and that it needed to be fixed. We did have group therapy at the hospital, but even that, the whole message behind the group therapy was that, okay, there's something wrong with how you're thinking. You're a teenager, there's something wrong with your perspective. You just need a different perspective on life and things will go better for you. So there was always this sense that your brain isn't working and you're thinking pretty irrationally as well. And I do wonder, I mean, I suppose that might have been helpful for me at the time. I'm not sure, though I always had this lingering sense that there was something wrong with my brain and that somebody needed to fix it for me. And I do wonder how things might have changed if I had encountered some of these different kinds of messages about depression, which I'll get to later. So I've always had this idea that one of my goals would be to promote paradigm change in the way that we think about mental health. And so now I'll talk a little more generally about the concept of paradigm change and some of the obstacles to it. So as I see it, bringing about paradigm change always involves a kind of twofold or two-pronged strategy. One side of that is critical, the other side of that is constructive. What I mean is that one side of that has to do with removing the current obstacles to paradigm change, and the other has to do with implementing new visions and new alternatives. And when it comes to removing obstacles to paradigm change, obviously some of those obstacles are quite practical, concrete. There are legal obstacles, there are economic obstacles, there are obstacles having to do with medical insurance reimbursement. But then there are obstacles of a more conceptual, philosophical, or even ideological nature. And as I see it, part of my role as a philosopher and a historian of ideas is really to identify some of the conceptual obstacles that stand in the way of paradigm change. And it is also to help clarify at a very general conceptual level some of the alternatives. But I'm going to frame my comments today really more on this critical side, which has to do with identifying the obstacles to paradigm change. Now, I should say I really hate using these kinds of military or combat metaphors, but as I've been thinking about this talk, I just keep coming back to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and share it with you. So, okay, if you were in a battle with a particular group of people, clearly the first thing you would need to do is identify your opponent. Who or what are you battling against? And any unclarity on this point, any vagueness on this point, any blurriness on this point is likely to lead you to squander your efforts and be less effective. Now, often enough, when I talk to people who are also interested in developing alternatives to the medical framework, and I say, what are you really opposed to? What do you take yourself to be against? What do you really want to move away from? People often say things like this: well, I want to move away from medical psychiatry, or I want to move away from this medicalized vision of psychiatry, or I want to move away from the medical model or the biomedical model, or something like that. And these expressions certainly help us to home in on our target, but they're not clear enough. And here's why. If you say to somebody, I think we need to really move away from the medical model of psychiatry, often enough, the way that psychiatrists and some mental health professionals will respond is they'll say this: well, we've already moved on. Maybe, maybe there was a time in the 80s or 90s where we were enamored with this medical model, but since then we've moved away from any kind of a shallow biological reductionism. Today, we take an integrated biopsychosocial perspective. We look at biological, psychological, social, even spiritual precursors to major mental health problems. Now, when psychiatrists and other mental health professionals say things like that, it can be very easy to kind of get into this headspace to get kind of insecure, where you start thinking, well, wait a minute, am I just seeing something that's not there? Have I really been misreading psychiatry that badly? Once a psychiatrist said to me, Justin, when I was talking about the medical model, he said, Justin, it sounds like you might have had some pretty bad experiences with psychiatrists in the past. You definitely have a lot of anger about that. Sounds like maybe you're taking your anger out on all of us, when really that psychiatrist or those psychiatrists that you were unfortunate enough to cross paths with aren't really representative of psychiatry as a whole. Again, you can get very confused and think that maybe you're really disconnected from reality. And of course, not to be too cynical, but that's exactly where a lot of psychiatrists want you to be mentally. They want you to suspect that your own anger or your own opposition to medical psychiatry is really maybe a symptom of past trauma or unresolved anger. So, all that to say, one reason it's very important to be clear about what we're opposed to is that you don't want to be susceptible to that kind of messaging. And so what I've come to after years of studying this from a historical and a philosophical point of view, the core idea that I want to target is what I call madness as dysfunction, or again, if you don't like the term madness, the dysfunction-centered paradigm of mental health problems.